The cold metal of my coffee mug did little to warm my hands as I stared at the contract on my laptop screen. After 15 years in Delta Force and another 5 running private security, I thought I'd seen every kind of contract imaginable. This one was different. The payment was astronomical, enough to retire on a private island, but that wasn't what caught my attention. It was the specifics they were looking for. Must have extensive experience in confined space operations and archaeological site protection. I read that line again, frowning. In my experience, those two requirements didn't typically go together. The client, a private research organization called the Helios Institute, wanted a 6-person team for what they called an asset recovery operation in northern Greenland. They specifically requested operators with special forces backgrounds and, oddly enough, experience working with historical artifacts. My phone buzzed. It was Rogers, my old teammate from Delta. "Ghost, tell me you got the same contract I'm looking at," he said when I picked up. Nobody called me James anymore. Hadn't since my first year in Delta when I'd managed to infiltrate what was supposed to be an impenetrable compound without triggering a single sensor. The Greenland job. Yeah, I'm looking at it now. Something feel off to you? Besides everything, Rogers laughed, but it was hollow. Did some digging. 3 months ago, they sent in another team. Geologists, archaeologists, some military escorts. Nobody's heard from them since. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the ceiling of my apartment. They're not the first, are they? No, Rogers said quietly. Started looking into that location. Every few decades, someone sends an expedition. 1940s, 1960s, 1980s, 2000s. None of them ever come back. But here's the weird part. Nobody talks about it. It's like each expedition gets erased from history. I pulled up the dossier attached to the contract. The facility was located 2 miles beneath the ice, supposedly an archaeological site of significant historical importance. The photos showed what looked like carved stone walls, but the architecture wasn't like anything I'd ever seen. The angles were wrong somehow, like they'd been designed by someone who had a different understanding of geometry. "They're offering triple the normal rate," I said. "Yeah, they're desperate, or we're expendable. Maybe both." Rogers paused. "I'm in if you are, Ghost. Rather do this with someone I trust, watching my 6. I looked at the photos again. Something about those walls made my skin crawl, but I couldn't look away. "I'll make some calls. Let's get the team together." Over the next week, I assembled the team. Besides Rogers and me, there was Wilson, our tech specialist, who'd served with the Navy SEALs. Rodriguez came on as our medic. He'd been Air Force pararescue before going private. Thompson was our science expert, with both military experience and a PhD in archaeology. Rounding out the team was O'Neill, our demo expert from the British SAS. The official briefing was held in a sterile conference room in Washington, D.C. Dr. Elizabeth Drake from the Helios Institute laid out the operation. Her words were precise, clinical, but her hands shook slightly as she pointed to the satellite imagery. The site was discovered during a routine ice core sampling operation, she explained. Ground-penetrating radar revealed a massive complex of chambers and corridors, all seemingly artificially constructed. The architecture and materials used suggest an origin far predating any known civilization. "What happened to the previous team?" Rodriguez asked. Dr. Drake's expression tightened. "We lost contact approximately 3 months ago. Their last transmission mentioned discovering something significant, but the details were unclear." "Unclear? How?" I pressed. The team leader's final message was largely incomprehensible. He spoke about watchers in the dark and claimed they'd found evidence of, she hesitated, of something that fundamentally challenges our understanding of human history. The briefing continued with technical details about our insertion and equipment, but my mind kept going back to those photos of the walls. There was something about them that nagged at me, like a word on the tip of my tongue. It wasn't until that night, staring at my ceiling at 3 a.m., that I realized what it was. The symbols carved into those ancient walls. I'd seen them before in a cave system in Afghanistan during a classified operation 10 years ago. We'd been tracking a high-value target, but the mission was suddenly aborted when our unit stumbled upon what our commanding officer would only refer to as an archaeological anomaly. I never knew what happened to the findings from that cave. All records of our mission were buried so deep that sometimes I wondered if I'd imagined the whole thing. But now, looking at these photos from Greenland, I knew I hadn't. Those same impossible symbols were there, carved into stone walls 2 miles beneath the Arctic ice, waiting for us. The research station sat on the edge of the world. In the perpetual darkness of the Arctic winter, it looked like a collection of metal boxes dropped onto an endless plain of ice. The temperature was 50 below zero, and the wind cut through our cold weather gear like razor blades. "Quite the holiday destination you've picked, Ghost," O'Neill shouted over the wind as we unloaded our equipment from the transport plane. His usual humor felt flat against the oppressive darkness and cold. The station itself was largely automated, with only a small maintenance crew that rotated out every 6 weeks. The current crew was due to leave the next day, and they couldn't seem happier about it. None of them would meet our eyes during the facility briefing. Our first red flag came during the equipment inventory. In one of the storage rooms, we found crates of gear from previous expeditions. The oldest ones dated back to the 1940s, Nazi equipment from what looked like a serious scientific expedition. The crates were perfectly preserved in the cold, their contents untouched. Why would they leave all this behind? Thompson wondered aloud, examining a vintage ice axe. Some of this equipment would have been extremely valuable, even in the 40s. Maybe they didn't leave it behind, Rodriguez said quietly. Maybe they never came back for it. The entrance to the shaft was in a reinforced bunker about 1 kilometer from the main station. The opening was perfectly circular, about 3 meters in diameter, dropping straight down into the ice. Modern climbing gear had been installed along the first 1,000 feet, but after that, we'd be relying on the ancient carved handholds and platforms we could see in the radar imaging. As we prepared for the descent, Wilson was checking the radar readings. His expression grew increasingly troubled. "What's wrong?" I asked, checking my harness for the 3rd time. "These readings don't make sense," he said. "According to this, the tunnel dimensions change every time we scan. Not by much, just a few centimeters, but..." He shook his head. "Must be equipment malfunction from the cold." The descent began smoothly enough. The first 1,000 feet were almost routine, just a long rappel down a smooth ice shaft. But then we hit the layer where the ice gave way to stone, and everything changed. The symbols started appearing on the walls, delicate spiral patterns that seemed to shift in our headlamp beams. They were identical to the ones I'd seen in Afghanistan, but here they covered every surface, forming intricate patterns that made my eyes hurt if I looked at them too long. "These aren't carved," Thompson said, his voice filled with confusion. "The symbols go through the stone. It's like they're part of the rock itself." About halfway down, our radios began picking up interference. At first, it was just static, but then we started hearing what sounded like whispers in an unknown language. Rodriguez claimed he could almost understand them, but every time he tried to focus on the words, they slipped away. Then, at around 8,000 feet down, all our electronic equipment failed simultaneously. Headlamps, radios, depth gauges, everything went dark. We hung there in the absolute darkness, the whispers seeming to grow louder in the silence. "Switch to chemical lights," I ordered, trying to keep my voice steady. The green glow of the light stick seemed weak against the overwhelming darkness, but it was better than nothing. That's when we noticed the temperature was rising. "This is wrong," Thompson said, checking his manual thermometer. "We're 2 miles beneath the ice. It should be getting colder, not warmer." As if responding to his words, a warm breeze began blowing up from below, a scientific impossibility that none of us wanted to think about too hard. It carried with it a smell like old books and wet stone, and something else, something none of us could identify but that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. The final 1,000 feet of the descent was done in near silence, broken only by the sound of our breathing and the occasional whisper of that impossible wind. By the time we reached the bottom, we were all drenched in sweat despite the supposedly freezing temperatures. We found ourselves in a massive chamber with walls that disappeared into the darkness beyond our light stick's glow. The floor was perfectly level, made of some kind of black stone that seemed to swallow the light. "Look at this," Rogers called out, his voice echoing strangely. He was examining something near the wall. As we approached, we saw it was a camera, a modern digital video camera, partially melted as if it had been exposed to extreme heat. "Property of Helios Institute," Wilson read from the warped label. "This belonged to the previous team." "Spread out," I ordered. "Standard search pattern, stay within visual range." We found more equipment scattered around the chamber: laptops, scientific instruments, climbing gear. All of it showed signs of extreme heat damage, but there were no signs of fire damage on the stone floor or walls. "Ghost," Rodriguez called out, his voice tight with tension. "You need to see this." In his light stick's green glow, we saw what had him spooked. A set of boot prints in the dust led to the wall and continued up it, as if whoever had made them had simply walked up the vertical surface. And they weren't the only ones. As we looked closer, we could see dozens of sets of prints on the walls and ceiling, going in all directions, defying gravity. "What the hell happened here?" O'Neill whispered. Before anyone could respond, we heard it, a sound like stone grinding against stone, coming from deep within the facility, and underneath it, almost too quiet to hear, what sounded like laughter. The chamber we found ourselves in turned out to be just an antechamber to something much larger. Following our maps, which were becoming increasingly unreliable, we made our way deeper into the facility. The architecture became progressively more bizarre, with corridors that curved in ways that seemed to violate basic geometry and rooms that appeared larger on the inside than their external dimensions should allow. The warmth we'd noticed during our descent increased as we went deeper, along with an odd humming vibration that we could feel through our boots. Thompson took readings with his backup instruments, the ones that hadn't fried during our descent. "The energy readings are off the charts," he muttered, frowning at his Geiger counter, "but it's not any kind of radiation I've ever seen before." We found the first body about 6 hours into our exploration. It was perfectly preserved, wearing a Wehrmacht uniform from the 1940s expedition. The corpse showed no signs of decomposition. It looked like the man had died yesterday, not 80 years ago. "This is impossible," Rodriguez said after examining the body. "There's no decay at all. Even in these conditions, there should be some deterioration." The dead soldier's expression was frozen in a rictus of terror, his eyes wide and staring at something none of us could see. His hands were bloody, fingernails torn off, apparently from clawing at the strange stone walls. That's when we first saw them, the Watchers. I noticed it first in the corner of my eye, a shadow that moved against the direction of our lights. When I turned to look directly at it, there was nothing there, but soon everyone was seeing them. Dark shapes that flitted just at the edge of vision, always disappearing when looked at directly. "They're watching us," Rodriguez said, his voice tight with tension. His behavior had become increasingly erratic over the past few hours. He kept stopping to stare at blank sections of wall, mumbling under his breath in what sounded like Latin, a language he'd never studied. We found the first piece of working technology in what Thompson dubbed the machine room. It was a vast chamber filled with crystalline structures that pulsed with an inner light. They were arranged in patterns that made my head hurt to look at, and they seemed to be functioning. "This is active technology," Wilson said in disbelief, running his hands over one of the crystals. "These energy readings, this system is still running after God knows how many thousands of years. Can you interface with it?" I asked. Wilson pulled out his laptop, one of our few pieces of equipment still functioning. "Maybe. These crystals seem to be storing and transmitting data, if I can figure out the basics." He trailed off as his laptop screen began displaying strings of symbols, the same ones we'd seen on the walls. They flowed across his screen like water, forming and reforming into new patterns. "It's trying to communicate," Wilson whispered. That's when Rodriguez started screaming. He was pointing at something none of us could see, his face contorted in terror. "They're here," he shouted. "The other teams, I can see them. They're still here, still trying to get out." Before we could stop him, he turned and ran down one of the corridors. O'Neill and I went after him while the others stayed with Wilson. We found Rodriguez about 100 meters away, crouched in a corner, whimpering. "They're trapped," he kept saying. "They're all trapped here. The Germans, the Russians, the Americans, all of them. They never left. They never left." We got him calmed down enough to return to the others, but he wasn't the same after that. He kept seeing things. People from previous expeditions, he claimed. He could describe them in perfect detail. The clothes they wore, the equipment they carried, even their names and ranks. Things he couldn't possibly know. When we got back to the machine room, Wilson had made progress with the crystals. "It's some kind of database," he explained, his eyes fever bright with excitement. "Massive amounts of information stored in these crystals. But it's not just a storage system, it's active. It's still recording." "Recording what?" Rogers asked. "Everything," Wilson said. "Every expedition that's ever come down here, every word they've said, every move they've made. It's all stored in these crystals, and something else, something deeper." As if on cue, the humming that had been our constant companion grew louder. The crystals pulsed faster, their light becoming almost blinding. And in that light, we all saw them clearly for the first time. The Watchers. They were like shadows given form, their shapes constantly shifting and changing. They moved through the walls as if they were water, gathering around us in a circle, and though they had no faces that we could see, we all knew they were watching us. That's when Thompson disappeared. He was there one moment, standing next to one of the crystals, and then he was just gone. No sound, no warning, just gone. The search for Thompson led us deeper into the facility, into areas that weren't on any of our maps. The architecture became even more impossible. Rooms that looped back on themselves, corridors that seemed to stretch for miles but could be crossed in a few steps. We found Thompson's flashlight in a room that shouldn't have existed, according to our maps. The beam was still on, illuminating a wall covered in fresh scratches. Scratches that formed words in Thompson's handwriting. "They showed me the truth. We have to wake them up. We have to let them out." The central archive chamber was vast beyond comprehension, a space so large that our lights couldn't reach the ceiling or the far walls. Crystalline columns rose from floor to infinity, each one pulsing with that same inner light we'd seen in the machine room. But here, the light was different. It moved with purpose, flowing between the columns like rivers of luminescence. Wilson had fully interfaced his laptop with the crystal technology by this point, though the process had taken its toll. His eyes were bloodshot, and he kept muttering equations under his breath, complex mathematical formulas that none of us understood. "It's not just a database," he explained, his fingers flying over the keyboard. "It's a monitoring station. These crystals, they're watching something deep below us. Below us." O'Neill looked at the floor with newfound unease. "How much deeper does this place go?" "The archive contains records going back." "I can't even comprehend the time frame," Wilson said, his voice shaking. "This facility, it's not just a building. It's a prison." The translation program Wilson had developed was beginning to decode more of the ancient text flowing across his screen. What we read made my blood run cold. "They call themselves the Architects," Wilson explained, eyes fixed on the streaming data. "They built this facility to contain something they called the Sleepers. Entities from somewhere else, another dimension maybe. The geometry of this place, the impossible physics, it's all part of the containment system." Rodriguez, who had been quiet since his episode, suddenly spoke up. "They're still here, the Architects, not alive, but preserved in the crystals. Their consciousness, their memories." "How do you know that?" I asked. But I think we all knew the answer. Rodriguez wasn't just seeing things. He was somehow accessing the stored memories in the crystals. We spent hours in the archive chamber piecing together the truth. The facility wasn't unique. It was one of several built across the globe, all designed to contain these sleepers. The architects had been an advanced civilization that discovered something they shouldn't have, entities that existed beyond our understanding of reality. According to this, Wilson said, the sleepers can't be destroyed, they can only be contained. The architects built these facilities to keep them dormant. But why are we here? Rogers asked. Why did Helios send us? Before Wilson could answer, a new set of symbols appeared on his screen. His face went pale. They knew, he whispered. Helios knew what this place was. They've been studying it for decades. All those lost expeditions, they were experiments. They wanted to see what would happen when humans were exposed to the containment technology. The implications hit us all at once. We weren't here to recover anything. We were test subjects. That's when the facility's deep humming changed pitch. The crystal columns began pulsing faster, their light becoming almost strobing, and we heard it, a sound that shouldn't have been possible in the underground chamber, the sound of massive stones grinding against each other coming from far below. They're waking up, Rodriguez said, his voice distant and strange. The sleepers are waking up. The first tremor hit without warning. The entire chamber shook, crystal columns swaying like trees in a storm. Dust and small stones rained down from the invisible ceiling above. Ghost, we need to move, Rogers shouted over the rumbling. This whole place is coming apart. But it wasn't coming apart. It was changing. The walls began to shift and flow like liquid, geometric patterns rearranging themselves into new configurations. Corridors sealed themselves shut while new ones opened. The entire facility was transforming around us. The containment systems, Wilson said, still staring at his laptop. They're activating. The facility is responding to the Sleepers Awakening. We tried to retreat the way we came, but that path no longer existed. The archive chamber had become a maze of shifting walls and pulsing crystal columns, and throughout it all, that grinding sound grew louder, accompanied now by something that sounded almost like singing, a deep, resonant tone that made our teeth vibrate and our vision blur. That's when we lost contact with Thompson again. One moment he was behind us, and the next, gone, swallowed by a wall that suddenly flowed into existence where he had been standing. Ghost. Rodriguez's voice was different now, deeper, older somehow. They're showing me, I can see. His eyes had gone completely black, reflecting the pulsing lights of the crystals. The previous team, they succeeded. They made contact, He stopped, his face contorting in horror. Oh God, they're inside them. The sleepers. They can move between hosts, like a virus jumping from mind to mind. The previous team, they're still here but they're not themselves anymore. As if to confirm his words, we heard laughter echoing through the shifting corridors. Familiar laughter. Thompson's laughter. We need to seal this place, Rogers said, gripping his weapon tighter. We can't let whatever's down here get to the surface. The decision was made for us when the grinding sound reached a crescendo, and the floor beneath our feet began to slope downward, as if the entire chamber was being pulled towards something far below. The sleepers, Wilson shouted over the noise. They're pulling the facility down to their containment level. They're trying to force a direct interface with the surface. The facility's transformation became more aggressive as we descended. Walls rippled like water, ceilings became floors, and gravity itself seemed to shift and twist. Wilson's translation of the archive data continued to stream across his laptop screen, revealing horrors we could barely comprehend. The architects weren't just an advanced civilization, Wilson explained, his voice cracking. They were the first civilization, the first humans, and they found something that had been waiting since before Earth formed. According to the archives, the sleepers were ancient beyond comprehension, entities that existed in the spaces between dimensions. They had been dormant until the architects discovered them, but that discovery was enough to wake them partially. The architects realized their mistake too late. Wilson continued. The sleepers could transfer their consciousness into human hosts. They could reshape reality itself. The only way to stop them was to build these facilities, prisons that operated on principles of physics we're only beginning to understand. But why are they waking up now? Rogers asked. The answer came from Rodriguez, his black eyes reflecting the crystal light, because that's what Helios wanted. Every expedition, every team they sent down here, they were trying to wake the sleepers up. They think they can control them, use their power. Thompson's laughter echoed through the facility again, closer now, but it wasn't just his voice anymore. It was a chorus of laughter, dozens of voices layered together, the voices of every expedition member who had ever been lost down here. The previous team succeeded, Rodriguez said. They made contact with the sleepers, but they didn't control them, they became them, and now... The grinding sound reached a new intensity, and suddenly the floor dropped away beneath us. We fell through shifting layers of reality, through spaces that couldn't exist, until we landed in a vast chamber that seemed to exist in more dimensions than our minds could process. And there, in the impossible geometry of that space, we saw them, the previous team, or what was left of them. Their bodies were twisted, reformed into shapes that hurt to look at. And behind them, vast and dark and ancient, we caught our first glimpse of the sleepers themselves. They were like holes in reality, spaces where the universe itself seemed to fold inward. The sleepers defied description, their forms constantly shifting between states of matter we had no words for. And they were awakening, their consciousness spreading through the facility like a virus. Thompson appeared then, but he wasn't Thompson anymore. His body moved in ways that broke the laws of physics, his smile too wide, his eyes reflecting spaces that couldn't exist. "We've been waiting for you," he said, but his voice was layered with countless others. "You're the key, the final component. Your consciousness, your understanding of this place. It's what we needed to fully wake up." The possessed Thompson explained that every expedition had brought the sleepers closer to full consciousness. Each human mind that encountered them became part of their collective awareness, helping them understand our reality better, helping them figure out how to exist in our dimension. "Your friend Rodriguez is already beginning to understand," Thompson said, gesturing to our teammate, whose eyes had gone completely black. "He can see the truth now. All of time, all of space, all of reality. It's all connected. And soon everyone will understand." That's when the facility's transformation reached its peak. The walls dissolved completely, revealing the true nature of the space we were in, a vast, interdimensional nexus point, where the boundaries between realities had grown thin. Wilson's laptop suddenly sparked and died, but not before displaying one final translation, the sacrifice protocol. "The architects built in a failsafe," Rodriguez said, his voice now a chorus of countless others. "A way to reset the containment system. But it requires a human consciousness," I finished, suddenly understanding. "Someone has to merge with the facility's systems willingly." The sleepers were fully awake now, their presence warping the space around us. Through the dissolving walls of reality, we could see other facilities around the world beginning to activate. The containment systems that had held for millennia were failing globally. We had a choice to make, and we had to make it fast. The team split on what to do. O'Neill and Rogers wanted to try to escape, to warn the surface about what was happening. Wilson believed we could still restore the containment systems without sacrificing anyone, but Rodriguez, or what was left of him, knew the truth. "It has to be done willingly," he said, his voice now a symphony of all who had come before. "The consciousness has to choose to become part of the system. That's why they could never force it. Why they had to keep sending teams down until someone understood enough to make that choice." The possessed Thompson and his chorus of lost souls pressed closer, their forms rippling with otherworldly energy. Through the cracks in reality, we could see the sleepers beginning to extend their influence toward the surface. "Ghost," Rogers said, his voice tight. "Whatever we're going to do, we need to do it now." I looked at my team, what was left of it. Rodriguez, half transformed by his connection to the facility's memories. Wilson, clutching his dead laptop like a shield. O'Neill and Rogers, weapons raised against enemies they couldn't possibly fight. And I knew what I had to do. The decision, once made, brought a strange kind of peace. I remembered everything that had led me here, that cave in Afghanistan with its impossible symbols, every mission that had pushed the boundaries of what I thought was possible, every choice that had brought me to this moment. "I can do it," I said. "I can interface with the system." "Ghost, no," Rogers started, but I cut him off. "Get to the surface," I ordered. "Someone needs to survive to tell the truth, to make sure no one tries this again." The possessed Thompson laughed, that horrible chorus of lost souls. "You don't understand what you're offering. To become part of the system. It's not death. It's an eternal existence as part of the containment. Conscious, aware, forever." "I understand exactly what I'm offering," I said. The process was simpler than I expected. The facility seemed to know what I was choosing, responding to my decision. The crystal columns pulsed in sync with my heartbeat. Reality itself seemed to bend around me. "Ghost," Rogers said one last time. "Go," I told them. "Run. Don't stop until you reach the surface." As my team retreated, I walked toward the nearest crystal column. Its light seemed to reach out to me, tendrils of energy wrapping around my body. The possessed Thompson tried to intervene, but the facility itself held him back. The last thing I saw as a human was my team disappearing up through the layers of shifting reality. Then I touched the crystal, and everything changed. I became the facility. I became the containment. My consciousness expanded through crystal matrices and impossible geometries. I could feel the sleepers, their ancient awareness pressing against the barriers of reality, and I could feel every other facility around the world. A network of containment systems all pulsing in sync. The sacrifice protocol activated. Reality reasserted itself. The sleepers were forced back into their dormant state. The facility sealed itself, layers of dimensional barriers locking into place, and I remained conscious, aware, eternal. Only Rogers made it to the surface. He emerged into the Arctic night 3 days after we had descended, though to him it felt like years had passed. His report was classified immediately. The Helios Institute dissolved overnight, its records erased. But deep below the ice, I watch. I maintain the containment. Through the crystal networks, I can see the other facilities around the world, each with its own guardian consciousness, its own eternal watcher. Sometimes new expeditions come, different organizations, different agendas, but always the same goal: to wake the sleepers, to harness their power. I do what I can to protect them, to turn them back. Sometimes I succeed, sometimes I don't. The sleepers remain dormant, but not asleep. They wait, they watch through eyes that exist in dimensions we can't perceive. And sometimes, in the spaces between moments, I can feel them trying to communicate. They show me visions of what they want. Reality reshaped, dimensions merged, existence transformed. They promise to make me a god in their new world. But I've seen the truth in the archives, in the memories stored in these crystals. I've seen what happened to the architects, to their world, to their reality. So I maintain the containment. I watch, I wait, and I pray that humanity never discovers what lies beneath the ice again. But they will. They always do. It's an endless cycle: discovery, awakening, containment. And each time someone like me must choose to become part of the system, to maintain the barriers between our reality and theirs. Rogers is still out there somewhere. Sometimes I catch glimpses of him through the global information networks that brush against the facility's systems. He's looking for the other sites, trying to prevent what happened here from happening again. But he's not alone in his search. The possessed Thompson and the others, they're still here with me in the facility, trapped between states of being. Sometimes I hear them laughing in the crystalline matrices. Sometimes they try to convince me to let them out, to wake the sleepers. Sometimes they seem almost human again. But I know the truth now. I understand what the architects understood, what every civilization that discovered the sleepers eventually learned. Some things are meant to stay buried. Some doors are meant to stay closed. Some knowledge is meant to stay hidden. And so I remain conscious, eternal, watching over ancient entities that dream of reshaping reality itself. I am the guardian, the containment, the eternal watcher in the dark. I am what I chose to become, and I am not alone.